It is dusk in Small Heath, Birmingham, 1895. The air tastes of sulphur and coal dust, a thick, choking smog that turns the gas lamps into hazy orange orbs floating in the gloom. The ceaseless rhythm of the drop hammers from the gun factories shakes the cobblestones beneath your feet, a mechanical heartbeat that never sleeps. Out of the shadows of an alleyway, a silhouette emerges. He is young, barely 20, but his walk suggests a man who owns the pavement. He wears a peaked flat cap pulled aggressively low over one eye, a silk scarf knotted tightly at the neck, and bell-bottom trousers that swish just above heavy, steel-tipped boots. As he passes under the street lamp, the light catches the glint of a heavy brass belt buckle wrapped around his fist. He is not a soldier, and he is not a celebrity gangster from a television screen. He is a slogger, a child of the industrial inferno, and he is about to terrorize the night. To understand the ferocity of the gangs that ruled the Birmingham streets, one must first understand the city that forged them. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Birmingham was not merely a city. It was the engine room of the British Empire, known globally as the workshop of the world. It was a city of 1,000 trades, a sprawling, chaotic warren of industry, where gunsmiths, jewelers, toy makers, and brass founders worked cheek by jowl in small, stifling workshops. Unlike the textile towns of the north with their giant, singular mills, Birmingham was a hive of small-scale, intense manufacturing. The noise was constant, a cacophony of steam whistles, hammers striking anvils, and the rattle of carts. The air was so thick with smoke that on bad days the sun was reduced to a pale, dirty coin in the sky, and the soot settled on everything, the washing, the windows, and the skin. The population had exploded, drawn in from the countryside and Ireland by the promise of work. But the housing had not kept pace. The workforce was crammed into the infamous courts of the back-to-backs. These were narrow, claustrophobic squares of houses built around a communal yard, often accessible only by a dark, tunnel-like alleyway. Sanitation was primitive, disease was rampant, and privacy was non-existent. In this environment, life was cheap, and survival was a daily bare-knuckle fight. There was no welfare state, no NHS, and no safety net. If a father lost his job, the family starved. If a mother fell ill, the children were on the streets. It was a dog-eat-dog existence where weakness was a death sentence. This crushing pressure cooker of poverty and overcrowding created a specific type of social friction. Young men, born into the squalor with no prospect of advancement and fueled by cheap beer, formed tribal allegiances based on their street or their district. They weren't initially criminal masterminds. They were territorial animals. They fought to defend their patch, to assert dominance in a world that treated them like grit in the machine. From this aggressive, desperate soil, the slogging gangs began to rise. Groups of youths who found that in a city that ignored them, violence was the only way to be seen. The newspapers of the day didn't initially call them gangsters. They called them sloggers. The term slogging was Victorian slang for fighting, heavy, brutal, and unrefined. These weren't the organized crime syndicates of the television screen, running international betting rings and shipping gin to America. At their inception, they were far more primal. They were loose collections of roughs and hard men from specific streets, Cheapside, Adderley Street or Park Street, who gathered on street corners to drink, gamble, and fight. Violence, for the slogger, was not just a means to an end. It was a form of recreation. In a life devoid of entertainment, where the only escape from the factory floor was the pub, a street fight was a sport. They would target police constables, rival gangs, or simply innocent passers-by who looked at them the wrong way. They were known for baiting the police, luring officers into the dark, narrow alleys of the slums where they could be swarmed and beaten. It was an assertion of power by the powerless, a way of saying, you may run the city by day, but we own the night. It was from this culture of slogging that the name Peaky Blinder emerged, making its first appearance in the press around 1890. And here we must address the most enduring myth of the modern age. The popular image of a razor blade stitched into the peak of a flat cap, used to blind enemies, is a brilliant piece of fiction, but historically it is almost certainly nonsense. In the 1890s, the disposable safety razor had only just been patented in America. In Birmingham, a packet of razor blades would have been a luxury item, costing a significant portion of a working man's weekly wage. To sew such an expensive, brittle tool into a soft cloth cap where it would likely snap or rust would have been economically madness. The reality of the name is both simpler and more fascinating. Peaky referred to the style of the cap itself, the flat cap with a stiffened peak which the gang members wore, pulled down hard over one eye to hide their faces and look menacing. Blinder was a piece of local Birmingham slang. If someone looked dashing, sharp, or impressive, they were said to be a blinder, much like we might say someone looks blinding today. So, a Peaky Blinder was essentially a dapper hooligan. They were men who fought with ferocious brutality but dressed with fastidious care. They stood out from the drunken, disheveled masses of the poor. They were the peacocks of the gutter. The name wasn't a description of a weapon, it was a description of an attitude. It signified a man who cared about his appearance as much as his reputation for violence. Unlike the tight-knit family unit of the Shelby clan portrayed in fiction, the real Peaky Blinders were not a single gang. The term became a generic label used by the police and the press for any youth street gang in Birmingham. Whether you were a Cheapside slogger or a Brummagem boy, if you wore the uniform and fought with the requisite savagery, you were branded a Peaky Blinder. They were a social phenomenon rather than an organized army. A symptom of a city where young men felt they had to carve out their identity with their fists. If the Slogger's reputation was built on violence, his identity was defined by his clothes. In the drab grey world of Victorian industrial slums, where most men wore ill-fitting second-hand workwear, the Peaky Blinder treated his appearance with obsessive detail. This was the uniform of terror. The distinguishing feature, of course, was the hat. The peaked flat cap was not just headwear, it was a mask. By wearing it tilted sharply to one side or pulled down low over the eyes, the gang member created an air of anonymity and menace. It forced people to look at his mouth, at the snare, rather than meeting his gaze. It was a psychological trick that made them seem unpredictable and dangerous. But the uniform went further. They wore bell-bottom trousers, which flared out at the ankle. This was a highly specific fashion choice, distinct from the straight-leg trousers of the respectable working class. The flare drew attention to the boots, more on those later, and gave their walk a distinctive swish and swagger. Around the neck, instead of a collar and tie, they wore a silk scarf, or daffy, knotted tightly. This was often white or brightly colored with polka dots, a flash of extravagance in the soot-stained street. The jackets were tailored, often made of heavy wool or moleskin, with brass buttons. The sheer cost of these clothes in a poverty-stricken area was a statement in itself. It said, "I have money, I have means, and I didn't get it from working in a factory." To walk through Small Heath dressed like this was a provocation. It was a visual challenge to the police and to rival gangs. It was the armor of the street king. If the razor blade in the cap was a myth, the real weaponry of the Birmingham gangs was far cruder and, in many ways, more brutal. The Peaky Blinders didn't need hidden blades. They used what was at hand, turning everyday objects into instruments of torture. The primary weapon was the belt buckle. These were heavy, solid brass buckles worn on thick leather belts. In a fight, the belt would be whipped off in seconds. It could be used as a flail, swinging the buckle at a distance to split skin and break bone, or wrapped tightly around the fist to create a terrifyingly effective knuckle duster. The scars left by these buckles were the tattoos of the Birmingham underworld. Then there were the boots. The hobnailed boot was standard footwear for the working man, but for the slogger, the steel toe cap and the metal studs on the sole were offensive weapons. Putting the boot in was not a metaphor. Once an opponent was down, they would be kicked mercilessly. The injuries inflicted, shattered ribs, broken jaws, ruptured organs, were devastating. Another favorite was the brick end, or a stone wrapped in a handkerchief. It was simple, disposable, and deadly. In the tight confines of an alleyway, a brick to the head ended a fight instantly. They also used short, heavy sticks known as coches or life preservers, weighted with lead, designed to crack skulls without breaking the skin too noticeably. Violence was also often directed at the police. In the baiting rituals, a lone officer would be surrounded. The gang would whistle, a piercing, distinctive sound that echoed through the streets, summoning reinforcements from the nearby pubs and houses. Officers were frequently hospitalized, and some were killed. The police in the 1890s were often terrified to enter certain districts like Garrison Lane or Thomas Street alone. The gangs ruled by fear, and their violence was performative, designed to shock, to maim, and to ensure that nobody in the neighborhood dared to cross them. The evolution of these street gangs from local nuisances into a national criminal force didn't happen in the back alleys of Small Heath. It happened on the open, grassy expanses of the British racecourse. And the catalyst was the First World War. When the men returned from the trenches in 1918, they were different. They had been brutalized by industrial warfare, desensitized to violence, and trained in discipline. The chaotic, scrappy street fighting of the pre-war sloggers no longer satisfied them. They wanted money. Real money. And in the 1920s, the only place where cash flowed like water, almost entirely unregulated, was the racetrack. Betting shops were illegal in Britain, and would remain so until 1961. If you wanted to place a bet, you had to go to the course. This meant that on race days, thousands of bookmakers stood on the rails with leather satchels stuffed with cash. It was a river of unpoliced money. Control the pitches, control the protection rackets, and you controlled the wealth. Enter the man who, unlike his fictional counterpart, Thomas Shelby, was the real king of the Birmingham underworld, Billy Kimber. Kimber was not a brooding, philosophical anti-hero. He was a terrifying, charismatic brute born in Summer Lane. A former brass founder and street fighter, he realized that the Birmingham gangs needed to stop fighting each other and start fighting for territory. He united the warring factions of the Peaky Blinders, the Birmingham Boys, and the Elephant and Castle mob into a formidable alliance known simply as the Birmingham Boys. Their target was the southern racecourses, Epsom, Ascot, and Lingfield. They descended on these polite, upper-class venues like a pack of wolves. They demanded protection money from the Jewish bookmakers from London's East End. If a bookie refused to pay for services, his blackboard was smashed, his takings were stolen, and he was beaten unconscious. This expansion brought them into direct conflict with the London gangs, specifically the Clerkenwell mob led by the notorious Darby Sabini, another character immortalized somewhat accurately in the show. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a war for the soul of the British black economy. The Racecourse Wars of 1921 were violent and public. The violence reached its zenith at the Battle of Epsom on Derby Day. Kimber's men, armed with hammers, bricks, and revolvers, ambushed a carabanc, a type of early bus, which they believed was carrying Sabini's gang. They attacked it with ferocious brutality, smashing the windows and dragging the occupants out to beat them. In a twist of dark comedy typical of the era, they had attacked the wrong bus. The victims were actually innocent bookmakers from Leeds, but the message was clear. The Birmingham gangs were no longer just local hooligans in flat caps. They were an organized, motorized, armed militia capable of projecting power hundreds of miles from home. For a brief, terrifying moment in the early 1920s, Billy Kimber and his Birmingham boys were the most feared men in England, effectively owning the sport of kings. However, the reign of the slogger was not destined to last forever. The city of Birmingham, embarrassed by its reputation as the most lawless place in Britain and tired of its police officers being used as punch bags, decided to strike back. The turning point came with the appointment of a new, uncompromising chief constable, Sir Charles Houghton Rafter. Rafter was an Irishman who viewed the gangs not as a social curiosity, but as a pestilence to be eradicated. He understood that the Peaky Blinders respected only one thing: brute strength. The existing police force, often made up of older, underfed local men, was simply not frightening enough. So, Rafter began a recruitment drive that changed the face of British policing. He looked outside the city. He recruited heavily from the rural counties and, crucially, from Ireland. He wanted farm boys, men who were used to hard physical labor, men who were naturally large, and men who had no family ties to the Birmingham slums. He raised the minimum height requirement. Suddenly, the Birmingham City Police Force was populated by giants. These were officers who stood 6 feet tall in their socks, towering over the malnourished street fighters of Small Heath. Rafter also changed the rules of engagement. He effectively sanctioned a policy of meet force with greater force. The police were trained to use their heavy woolen capes as shields, wrapping them around their left arms to deflect belt buckles and brick ends, while wielding their truncheons with their right. They stopped patrolling alone and started moving in squads. The judicial system tightened the noose alongside them. For years, gang members had treated fines as a business expense. When a member was arrested, the gang would have a whip round, a collection in the pub to pay the fine, and the thug would be back on the street the next morning, a hero. Rafter pushed the magistrates to stop issuing fines and start issuing prison sentences without the option of payment. The impact was devastating for the gangs. The hard men could handle a fist fight, but they couldn't handle the crushing boredom and hard labor of Winson Green Prison. One by one, the charismatic leaders were removed from the chessboard. The swagger began to disappear from the streets. You couldn't stand on a corner in your peaked cap and bell-bottoms intimidating passers-by if a 6'2" Irish constable was going to drag you into a cell. By the mid-1920s, the open warfare of the slogging era was effectively over. The police had reclaimed the pavement. The Peaky Blinders hadn't vanished completely. Crime never does, but they had been beaten into the shadows. The era of the flamboyant, brazen street king was dead, replaced by a quieter, more covert criminal underworld that knew better than to challenge the law to a straight fight. As the 1920s bled into the 1930s, the visual identity of the Birmingham slums began to change. The distinctive silhouette of the Peaky Blinder, the peaked cap, the neck scarf, the bell-bottoms, slowly faded from the streets, becoming a relic of a rougher past. Fashion moved on. The younger generation, perhaps influenced by the cinema and the desire to look modern, abandoned the flamboyant uniform of their fathers. But the disappearance wasn't just sartorial. It was physical. The slums themselves, the very breeding grounds of the gangs, were beginning to be thinned out. The first waves of slum clearances and the expansion of the suburbs meant that the tight-knit, claustrophobic communities that had birthed the gangs were being dismantled. The territory that the Sloggers had fought and died for, Garrison Lane, Montague Street, was changing. Families were moving away to new estates. The fierce loyalty to a specific street corner diluted as the population spread out. Crime, too, evolved. The raw, disorganized violence of slogging, fighting for the sake of fighting, gave way to more sophisticated, profit-driven ventures. The Racecourse Wars had shown that there was money to be made in organized rackets, but the heavy police presence meant it had to be done quietly. The bludgeon was replaced by the bribe. The open street brawl was replaced by the backroom deal. The Birmingham underworld didn't disappear, but it put on a suit and tie and learned to keep its voice down. However, while the gangs themselves dissolved, the name Peaky Blinder refused to die. It seeped into the folklore of the city, becoming a generic bogeyman term used by mothers to frighten naughty children. For decades in Birmingham, if a youth was acting tough or dressing aggressively, he wasn't called a hooligan. He was called a Peaky Blinder. The specific history was lost, but the reputation for terror remained. Then, in the 21st century, a strange resurrection occurred. With the arrival of the global television phenomenon, these violent, poverty-stricken street thugs were transformed into glamorous, romantic anti-heroes. Birmingham, a city often maligned and overlooked, suddenly found itself the capital of cool. The peaky haircut, shaved back and sides with a heavy top, became the most requested style in barber shops from London to New York. The flat cap, once the badge of the working poor, became a high-fashion accessory. Today, you can go to Peaky Blinder-themed weddings. You can drink in Peaky Blinder-themed bars. Men dress up as Billy Kimber or Thomas Shelby for stag do's, donning the tweed and the boots, raising a glass to a lifestyle that, in reality, was miserable, short, and brutal. There is a deep irony in this. The real men behind the myth, the Sloggers of Cheapside and Small Heath, were not noble warriors fighting for their family. They were desperate men born into a city that didn't care if they lived or died. They didn't walk in slow motion to rock music. They ran from the police in the rain. They didn't have honor codes. They blinded people with belt buckles for looking at them the wrong way. In turning them into folk heroes, we have sanitized the crushing poverty that created them. We celebrate the style, the swagger, and the violence, but we often forget the smell of the open sewers, the hunger in the belly, and the utter hopelessness that forced a generation of young men to turn their fists into weapons just to survive the week. When the lights of the modern themed bars fade and the television screens are switched off, the ghosts of the real Peaky Blinders retreat back into the shadows of history. It is easy to judge them by the standards of today, to see them merely as violent thugs who terrorize their own communities. And in many ways, they were. They were brutal men who inflicted pain without hesitation, but to condemn them without context is to ignore the fire in which they were forged. These were men born into a city that was working itself to death. They were the sons of the workshop of the world, raised in the deafening noise of the drop forges and the suffocating smoke of the back-to-backs. They lived in a society where life was cheap, where the law was distant, and where strength was the only asset a man truly owned. The slogger didn't fight because he was inherently evil. He fought because he was invisible. In a world that treated him like a cog in a machine, the violence, the terrifying reputation, and the immaculate, expensive clothes were a way of screaming, "I exist." So, the next time you see a flat cap, whether on a screen or on the street, don't just think of the glamour or the razor blades. Think of the real men of Cheapside and Small Heath. Think of the brass belt buckles and the hobnailed boots. But most of all, think of the desperation. They were the lost boys of the Industrial Revolution, creating a brutal brotherhood in the dark, trying to stand tall in a city that was designed to keep them on their knees.